Yes, I'm back with the old background, and I'm also back with a car that I remember from my childhood, the Vauxhall Victor. I only remembered the last generation, which to my eyes looked a little bit out of date by the mid to late 70s, but it's been one of those cars I've always wondered about, and when a viewer reminded me about it recently, I decided to discover its secrets. By the early 1950s, America was a car production powerhouse led by two companies, Ford and General Motors. Both had produced successful cars for decades and the odd tank and aircraft during the war, and this had been highly profitable that had fueled further expansion. Ford in the UK was called, well, Ford, but General Motors were much happier with different brand names such as Chevrolet, Pontiac, Cadillac, and in the UK, Vauxhall. Along with cars like the Viva and the Cresta, the Vauxhall Victor wasn't only going to whup all the domestic competition, but cars from rival Ford as well. It was produced in-house by British stylists and British engineers and built in Luton. But after 5 generations, the Victor name was dead and future cars were being styled and engineered in Germany. What happened? This is the Vauxhall Victor story. In the early 50s, things were looking up in the UK. Rationing of raw materials was ending, which meant car production was going up. Vauxhall saw this as a chance to expand, with the blessing of parent General Motors, of course, and sought to produce 2 new cars, a smaller 4-cylinder and a larger 6-cylinder. The USA had exotic styling, which Vauxhall and especially GM thought would play well in the UK. What's more, GM had developed a wraparound windscreen that was seen as a game changer. It would make the car the height of fashion. So a suitably American-styled car was produced in clay, a pint-sized version of the 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air. Vauxhall said that there wasn't the staff to develop both the 4-cylinder and the 6-cylinder cars, although in GM's mind it was maybe that Vauxhall couldn't find enough creative ways of working smarter. That was the American way after all. No matter, GM farmed out the development of the 4-cylinder car to one of their teams in Detroit. The full-size clay model was dutifully shipped to Detroit, but this didn't go well. A car clay is heavy but delicate, and it was damaged in transit. The Detroit workers decided to fix it without consulting Vauxhall, and while they were at it, they made some improvements in their eyes, such as bulging side panels. Once Vauxhall's designers got a look at what had been done, they demanded it was returned to their original vision. They got some changes, but not all. A prototype car was duly built in Detroit and shipped back to the UK. Vauxhall's new car would include a new rust prevention system. 2 chemicals were applied before the primer and the underbody was sealed against moisture with a plastic skin. British production was ramping up on schedule. As things were going so well, GM ratcheted up the pressure by moving up the launch date. To satisfy their American overlords, this meant that rather than working around the clock, Vauxhall cut corners in production and testing. What's more, some of this tooling design was taking place in Detroit, and in the days before cheap flights and Zoom calls, maintaining control of both projects under a tight deadline was nigh on impossible. The launch deadline moved up another 2 months, so the 2 cars shown at the Geneva Motor Show had to be hand-built as the production line had such atrocious build quality. But no one would know of these problems. The launch was a glitzy affair given to the world's press, with a piece of music especially composed for the new car, dubbed the Vauxhall Victor, and even 16 special dresses were created and modelled next to the car. Vauxhall's American-looking car was ultra-modern and was going to blow away the competition. But while the foreign press praised the Victor, British journalists didn't like the brash American styling and signature wraparound windscreen. Anyone who got a Victor test drive was put in a draw for a new car. This was a massive success, with over 75,000 test drives. Brits love a good deal. The Victor, with its 1.5-litre engine and 3-speed manual gearbox, was one of Vauxhall's most popular models, and export sales boomed. It was sold in the USA through Pontiac dealers, and with the production line at capacity, Vauxhall celebrated its 100,000th car just 15 months after production began, becoming the fastest selling British car to date. It was also Britain's #1 export. With the focus on getting the Victor launched as soon as possible, the Luton designed estate model was delayed. It appeared a year later in 1958, soon with the option of a Newton drive transmission that gave semi-automatic shifting. But almost as soon as the car launched, problems began to surface. The rush to market meant door seals didn't do much sealing, something Detroit had identified as a problem. That Newton drive transmission was hard to use and was almost immediately dropped. But one problem that didn't have a good solution was rust. The Victor had been lauded as being better at resisting corrosion than other cars, but those leaky door seals let in water. Salt from winter roads damaged the plastic coating, and soon Victors around the world were disintegrating in front of their owners' eyes. This was fixed on the production line by 1959, but by then rust had done its damage both to the Victor and Vauxhall's reputation. Vauxhall stylists in the UK also had to do something about those looks. GM in the US strictly forbade any Victor changes. Why do work when the car was selling so well? But regardless, the UK team made a mock-up of what a Victor Series 2 would look like. A few months later, when the US Pontiac dealers came knocking on Detroit's door wanting changes, GM asked Vauxhall to make a Series 2 mock-up. Vauxhall said that they'd get right on that, and after a suitably short delay, they presented what they'd already produced. The new model launched in 1959 and was almost universally accepted as an improvement. When combined with the production improvements, that meant the car was something you'd actually want to own. It looked like the Vauxhall Victor was back on track, with 250,000 sales in less than 3 years. Canadian Vauxhall dealers called for GM to supply them with a new, unique car like the Victor. GM allowed the Victor to be modified to look a little different, and it was sold there as the Envoy. With the next generation Victor delayed due to a worldwide economic slowdown, the Victor got another styling update in 1960. By now the engineering issues had been corrected, making this a great buy. But in the US, the car and the Vauxhall brand were becoming toxic. A further rust problem had developed on those early cars that meant some snapped in half. Pontiac dealers who had domestic cars that they'd rather sell avoided selling them to the public, and stateside Victor sales died. Work began on the next generation Victor in 1959, and the plan was to fix all the problems with the original car. No rusting, no dodgy door gaps, and a design that customers would love instead of tolerate. The new, less controversial and clean shape was shown to the new GM president on his British visit, who said he thought it could do with some tail fins. This wasn't just an American reaction that all cars needed tail fins. The Austin Cambridge, Morris Oxford and the Ford Consul all had tail fins, as did the first generation Victor. But Vauxhall's design team were pushing for a new, modern, British design with none of the American flair that had put customers off the original Victor. They felt that tail fins were out, but orders are orders, and they were bodged on in such an ugly way that they were eventually rejected. By 1960, both the saloon and the estate were finalised, ready for production. The new shape was lower, yet there was actually more space inside. The shape was simpler, and after the engineering team was done with the mechanicals, it was 36 kilos lighter than the old car. The 1.5 litre engine got a little bit more power. There was now the option of a 4-speed manual with synchromesh on all gears for the new high-speed M1 motorway that swept past the Luton factory. The suspension was improved, and the lower centre of gravity helped through the bends. There was less maintenance required, and the car went longer between services. All this added up to a car that cost Vauxhall less to produce and for the owner to run, and was better in almost every measure for not a penny more. It was maybe the car Vauxhall should have made a few years earlier. But this car was still a long way from today's cars when it came to modern conveniences. On the base model, the heater was an optional extra. Vauxhall investigated making a 2-door open top, but as the Victor was only a 4-door, the cost for making longer front doors and the low volume of the convertible likely doomed it. There was also a plan to make a van out of the estate. An easier proposition was making a sporty version, a Cavalier SRI for the 1960s, before souped-up family saloons became a thing. When Vauxhall launched this car, they didn't pitch it as a sports model, despite it having stiffer suspension and 44% more power. The car was called the VX490, although on marketing materials Vauxhall never quite called out why it was called that. Some say that in a time when many family cars, including the Victor, could barely crack 70 miles an hour, this new four-cylinder car could go 90 miles an hour. Others say it was because the capacity of the engine was 90 cubic inches. Where the original Victor highlighted the latest in American styling, at the extravagant launch of the second generation Victor in 1961, Vauxhall talked about the car's British styling roots. They talked down American style, which was almost an admission that the original car had gone in the wrong direction. The reaction from the public and Vauxhall dealers was just what the doctor ordered: universal acclaim. The VX490 was the icing on the cake, a hot version to get customers in the door. And thankfully for a car with stiffer suspension to handle the corners, the new car could be ordered with two individual passenger seats instead of the standard front bench seat. Over in the US, the dealer reaction was more tepid. They were still dealing with the awful rust problems from the previous car and didn't want to see anything with the Vauxhall badge on the back. Only a few Pontiac dealers took the plunge and stocked them. Just 500 new Victors were sold in the US and sales ended in 1962. Vauxhall never returned to the USA. But it was still sold in Canada as the Envoy, and with the previous car was sold in Australia and New Zealand, where it was also assembled. In the UK the car sold well. It was a good price, and that price would go down, not up over time. 2 years later the entry-level car was 15% cheaper, with a larger 1.6 litre engine that was 22% more powerful and with longer service intervals. Brits truly never had it so good. The second generation Victor sold just as well as the first generation, despite the additional dead weight of bad publicity from rust, quite an impressive feat. But it needed to improve as there was stiffer competition in the form of the slightly smaller Ford Cortina, although in comparisons Vauxhall was clearly focusing on the Hillman Minx. Never standing still, as soon as the second generation Victor launched, work began on the third generation car. One of its signature features was to be a concave rear window, a new styling feature from GM that was supposed to keep the glass clear. This concave styling feature was duplicated on the dashboard. Increased passenger space was important, and curved glass on the side of the car allowed the stylist to achieve this. It made the interior 10 centimetres wider in a car that was only 1 centimetre wider, and this made it easier to get through in the back. It wasn't all good news though. The new seats meant that there was a little less legroom in the front. Comfort also improved with the new heating system that was better at keeping people warm in harsh conditions. It also included a pass-through that warmed those in the back as well as the front. There was more torsional stiffness that improved handling, but other than upgraded suspension, the mechanicals were largely the same. After all, the team were busy getting the new Vauxhall Viva out the door. Under the hood, the Victor was business as usual, the same engine as the previous car with a tweak in performance. There was the same choice of a 3 or 4-speed manual. The 3-speed was still a column selector like the original Victor. This combined with the front bench seat meant that the car could seat 6 at a push. What was new was a focus on sound deadening materials between the engine and the interior. It was sorely needed as the Victor was loud at high speeds compared to the competition. The new Victor was launched as the Victor 101. Why was it called 101 when the other two cars had just been called the Victor? Well, it was all part of the new numbering system. This car would be the 101 and the next generation would be the 102. The press gave the 101 a lukewarm response. It was better, but they weren't in love with the new shape with its concave rear window. The Corsair and the smaller Cortina both came with a 4-speed manual as standard rather than the Victor's 3-speed, and the Cortina had an optional automatic. Vauxhall had their own stab at an automatic, the Power Glide from North America, but it was positively awful. It was only a 2-speed that was normally allied to a 6 or 8-cylinder engine. This meant that it ate fuel, was very slow, and probably lost more customers than it gained. The Victor 101 made further advances in rust prevention with splash guard panels behind the front wheels. But the new car had more corrosion problems than the old one, as the chrome or metal strips that went over the top of the wings trapped water. Those splash guards actually made rust worse by collecting water and dirt behind the screws that attached them. The new VX490 was a bit of a letdown. The engine wasn't any more powerful than the old car, even though the base model had more power. It cost a lot more as well, so it's not a surprise that it didn't sell well. Customers instead plumped for Ford's Cortina GT and Lotus Cortina that were being correctly marketed as sports saloons hanging a wheel out on racetracks up and down the country. The VX490 could have been so much more. Vauxhall's styling department were looking at lots of wild sports car prototypes around this time, and I've done a video about it linked above. So it's not that surprising that Vauxhall looked to make a truly sporting Victor with the Vettura concept. This was a car that looked more at home in 1975 rather than 1965, but GM's management weren't impressed and the genuinely futuristic design didn't go into production. While the VX490 sales stalled, the new Victor 101 sold well, at least initially, with 100,000 produced in 10 months. But after that, demand dropped. Vauxhall only sold 233,000 over the life of the car, compared to 328,000 of the previous generation over a similar period. And all this despite BMC launching the Austin 1800 that was a flop. The Austin 1100 might be smaller, but it was faster and more fuel efficient, which might explain why it sold so well in the 1960s. Car Magazine compared the Victor with the Corsair and found Ford's car was the better deal. The Victor was coming up against stiff competition and was found wanting. This was all at a time when GM was investing heavily in Vauxhall's styling department so that they could produce next generation designs to make Vauxhall the #1 car maker in the UK, if not in Europe. A new wind was sweeping car design, and again it came from the United States. The Coke bottle shape had its roots in fighter aircraft of the 1950s, and by the early 60s it was gaining traction. The Victor 101 had failed to excite, so Vauxhall needed something to help it sell, and the new American styling might just work. Early designs had a transatlantic swagger with a shape that was actually a little smaller than the old car and certainly lower. It looked a lot like the 1970 Ford Cortina, but styled 5 years earlier. Vauxhall's new design centre was surely money well spent. There was the usual estate proposal, as well as the option of a sports coupe for the first time. After all, the new Ford Mustang was turning heads across the pond. Customers loved the similarly styled 1966 Viva, which gave Vauxhall confidence that they were on the right track. The coupe would be dropped, which meant that there wasn't anything exciting at the top of the range. There was always the VX490 and there were thoughts of making it front-wheel drive, but with the regular Victor rear-wheel drive that would have meant duplicated work that would have wasted money on a niche model. Vauxhall's VX490 plan was tweaking the engine by a few horsepower and putting flashes down the side, but that hadn't worked for the last 2 models, so why would it work now? And what's more, Vauxhall needed more than a single 1.6 litre engine for the whole Victor range. Customers were demanding a car with a range of engines, like the Ford Cortina. Vauxhall thought of going big, much bigger than the Cortina's 1.6 litre engine, with a 3.3 litre 6-cylinder engine installed in the top-of-the-range sports saloon that Vauxhall called the Ventura. The mainstream Victor would get a new 1.6 litre engine. The programme had begun in 1963 and took 3 years to refine. The goal was laudable and logical: create one design of engine that could be used as a 4, 6 or 8-cylinder petrol or diesel, just extend the engine block, or in the case of the V8 conjoin 2 4-cylinder blocks together. A one-size-fits-all would reduce development, testing and production costs with fewer unique parts across the range of Vauxhall cars and Bedford vans. That logic failed to make it to production though. Vehicles had existing engines and it was too easy to keep them rather than investing in the development work to shift to one engine design. In the end, the design only became a 1.6 litre and a 2 litre petrol engine. Of course, if these engines had been used across GM's worldwide range of vehicles, the company could have saved even more money, especially if GM could have lobbied governments for similar emissions regulations. But in the 60s, GM was a group of different fiefdoms that didn't communicate as effectively as they should. The years of development produced a better engine with more power. The 1.6 litre now had 83 horsepower instead of 70 horsepower. This gave the regular Victor more power than the VX490 without needing an aluminium head or twin carburetors. The gearboxes were the same 3- and 4-speed manual from the previous car, but there'd be a new Borg-Warner automatic to keep up with Ford. Up until this point, steering wheels had been the things to impale drivers in a crash, a long metal rod right in front of your heart that caused many road deaths. The new Victor was the first British-built car to have an energy-absorbing steering column, the forerunner of today's collapsible columns. It was also the first Vauxhall with front and rear crumple zones, and front seatbelts were now standard equipment. It was in this way that the new Victor took great strides in safety that would be recognised by industry awards. And with Vauxhall still known for corrosion, particular attention was paid to rust prevention. By rights, the new car should be known as the Victor 102, given the old car was the Victor 101, but Peugeot had got first dibs on 3-letter car numbers with a 0 in the middle, and Vauxhall was forced to abandon their car numbering system after just one car, meaning the first 4 generations were known as the Victor, Victor, Victor 101 and Victor. Quite confusing, especially as a few press photographs had cars with a 102 badge on them. The Victor Not 102 launched at the Earl's Court Motor Show in October 1967. The press loved the looks and the new engine and the option of a new 2-litre engine as the Victor 2000, and they awarded it Car of the Show. From the side, it almost looked like the luxurious Ford Granada that would appear 5 years later. This was a car that was going to sell well. Vauxhall was back on track. It needed to as well, with new competition in the form of the Hillman Hunter, but out of the gate the new Victor sold well. A year later, in 1968, the Estate launched, as well as the new 140 horsepower 3.3 litre 6-cylinder sports saloon badged as the Vauxhall Ventura and pitched as the Lazy Fireball. On the surface, this looked like a great car, lots of power, great styling, bags of luxury, what wasn't to like? But look closer and the trim levels didn't make much sense. For a car that was a high-end offering, the heated rear window was extra, as were the variable wipers. You couldn't recline the front seats no matter which trim level you selected. Like the previous Victor, sales started strong but tailed off quickly. The disappointing sales extended to the Canadian market. They were so low that Vauxhall stopped selling the Victor there in 1970. But there was some reason to celebrate the return of the VX490. Its return was partly to give European countries something exciting under the 2-litre tax limit to sell, and partly to put some vim into the Victor range, given the next generation car had been delayed until 1972. The overhead cam engine boosted the top speed to just over 100 miles an hour, and it made a good addition to the Victor lineup. While the 4th generation Victor offered a lot of promise, sales had disappointed, with less than 200,000 sold over 5 years. That was roughly the same amount the previous car had sold over 4 years, and nothing like the almost 100,000 car per year run rate of the original Victor. This could be partly the responsibility of the long strike in 1970, but then many car companies were hit with strikes that year. The biggest selling car of the late 60s were smaller models like the Austin 1100 and the Ford Cortina, or the new Ford Escort. As car producers worked out how to get more interior space, car buyers realised they didn't need to buy such large cars or spend so much money to get the same level of comfort. But crucially, customers weren't picking smaller cars from Vauxhall like the Viva, they were increasingly buying from arch-rival Ford. For the 5th generation Victor, one of the line items was again giving the car buyer more interior space for the same size car. There was also the obligatory style update, but this would be more of a reskin after much of the mechanicals had been overhauled the last time around. Initial plans again lent heavily on American styling cues, and there was another coupe proposal, something that could have been pitched against the Ford Capri. But while design work was progressing, Vauxhall's ledgers were filled with red ink. Sales of the Viva were doing okay, as were Bedford vans, but too much was being spent on development and production. GM wasn't happy. Ford held 2 of the top 3 spots in the UK sales charts in 1969, and Vauxhall's Viva and Victor were nowhere to be seen. One of the casualties of these financial problems was the new Victor. GM decided the next generation Victor would share the same platform as the Opel Rekord, a car a whole 10 centimeters longer. They also chose not to replace the larger Cresta, meaning the Victor was now the top of the range. Worse still, the new Opel Rekord wouldn't be available until 1972, which is why the 4th generation Victor got an update in 1970 to keep it fresh for a bit longer with the VX490 I talked about earlier, and also the luxurious Ventura 2 designed to take over from the Cresta. While Ford's cars looked the same across Europe, GM was still allowing Vauxhall to make their cars look a little different from Opel's. This was because Opels were sold in the UK and Vauxhalls were sold on the continent. They were distinct cars competing against each other, but now they would be badge-engineered models that competed against each other. Vauxhall's styling team had the tricky task of taking the styling work they'd done for the 5th generation Victor and making it work on the Opel Rekord platform that was a different size. It took until early 1969 for the first mock-ups to appear. The engineering team had a similar problem. Take their new-ish Vauxhall overhead cam engine, steering and suspension and bolt it to Opel's platform, and while they were at it, improve the suspension, which was seen as a bit lumpy. This was platform reuse, but with a high degree of duplication. In fact, with GM specifying how much Opel should be in the car and Vauxhall's default position to make a car with Vauxhall parts, Vauxhall assigned people solely to monitor the Vauxhall-Opel mix to be sure that GM overlords would be happy. Of course, sharing the development and production between the two companies should have started years earlier, and it's the fault of GM, Opel and Vauxhall that it had taken this long. Vauxhall and Opel were each distinct empires with pride in their existing components. Vauxhall still used imperial units where Opel used metric. How could it even work? These were issues that Ford was hard at work resolving between their German and UK teams, but GM was slower to act. The estate got a new dashing sloping roof that robbed the car of some practicality, but gave a type of car that was usually so practical some much needed panache. With the top-of-the-range Cresta disappearing, there were plans to offer an upmarket Victor as the Viscount. It helped that the new Victor was larger than the previous model, with a wheelbase only 5 centimeters shorter than the Cresta, and with the increased interior space, the cars were very similar inside. But in the end, the range topper would once again be the Ventura, again with a 6-cylinder engine. Vauxhall even experimented with a sporty Ventura SS using a Holden 4.2-litre V8 engine. The idea of introducing the Ventura SS or a V8 Viscount survived until 1973, but it was killed by the fuel crisis. The V8 would only be seen on the racetrack as the Ventura DTV V8, dubbed Big Bertha, a car designed to give the Victor and Ventura models some pizzazz. The new car was put through its paces like no other before it to be sure it was both reliable and resistant to rust. The 5th generation Victor and Ventura range launched with a splash pitched as the Transcontinentals. This was a car that could whisk you on auto routes across Europe to a week of downhill skiing or a glass of sangria by the beach. That all sounds fantastic, but simple decisions have knock-on effects. Vauxhall decided to add anti-vibration panels to the underside of the car. This added 62 kilos of weight that meant it was slower than the old Victor. That meant more power was needed to compensate. The 1.6 litre became a 1.8 litre, the 2 litre became a 2.3 litre. This meant, on average, worse fuel economy, not ideal as the fuel crisis was just around the corner. Like the previous Ventura, there was a 3.3 litre 6-cylinder engine and a 2.8 litre was included in some markets. The previous Victor base model had featured a 3-speed manual. Thankfully, Vauxhall moved with the times and upgraded the budget model to a 4-speed along with the usual optional automatic. Given the independent styling work from both Opel and Vauxhall, they maybe needn't have bothered. There was a distinct similarity between the two cars, and a lot of money and effort could have been saved. Surprisingly for 1972, the base model, called the Deluxe, still came with a front bench seat, very 1950s Americana, and this was deleted the following year. The Opel Rekord went for quarter lights on the rear doors that allowed the windows to wind down all the way. Vauxhall preferred a cleaner look of one piece of glass, but that meant the window only rolled down a third of the way. This was pitched as a safety feature for small children because, of course, a big problem in the early 1970s was kids falling out of cars willy-nilly. If it was such a good safety feature, then, like child locks, surely this should be something the owner could turn on and off. In reality, it was just another reason not to buy a Victor. The dashboard was more an evolution from the previous car, but it got the job done, offering all the important controls in the right places. But over time, the cheap plastic rattled and creaked. In fact, overall interior quality lacked for such a large car. But thanks to the new Opel platform, rear passenger legroom had increased by 10 centimetres. Motoring journalists were whisked away to exotic Portugal to test the new Victor, but came away underwhelmed. Yes, it was better than the old car, but when compared to rivals, especially European rivals, it fell short. The 1.8 litre engine lacked power, and this was exacerbated by a large gap between second and third. There was wind noise from the rear doors, the front seats didn't provide enough comfort. Vauxhall didn't give customers any reason to choose the Victor over, say, the new Granada. In group tests, the Victor and the luxury Ventura came off worse not just to the Ford Granada, but to its sister car, the Opel Rekord and Commodore, with Vauxhall's car criticised for its handling. So all that work moving over the old Victor suspension and improving it had been wasted effort. It seemed Opel knew how to make better cars than Vauxhall. Reviewers preferred the 4-cylinder in the VX490 to the 6-cylinder Ventura as well. It just wasn't worth the extra money. But then any sporty car with handling issues was always going to face an uphill battle. In 1976, the Victor name was dropped and the car was simply known as the VX. The 6-cylinder engines were out of date, outclassed, and in this new age of higher fuel prices were expensive. The range was quickly whittled down to just 4-cylinder models, and the VX490 was given a boost in 1977 with a 5-speed gearbox. But the public never warmed to the new Victor VX, and it sold the worst of all the 5 generations, even though it was on sale for longer, 6 years. GM's patience with Vauxhall's styling and engineering team had finally run dry. In the 50s, they hadn't done the American thing and redoubled their efforts to take on 2 projects. In the 60s, GM had pumped money into the teams, but all they'd seen were losses and a car that failed to live up to what Ford was producing. Opel, on the other hand, were making good, solid cars. All UK styling and engineering ended. Not only would future Vauxhall cars be engineered in Germany by Opel, they'd be styled there as well. The Victor was replaced by the new Opel Rekord in 1977 and was sold as the Vauxhall Carlton, the only major change being the droop snoot nose that had become a Vauxhall trademark and had also been styled before the Vauxhall team were cut. The Ventura was replaced by the Opel-designed Vauxhall Royale. But that wasn't quite the end for the Victor. Like other car companies with production lower than expected, Vauxhall saw that they could make a bit of extra money out of the lightly used tooling by offering it to another car maker, in this case Hindustan Motors, the Indian company behind the Ambassador that was originally sold as the Morris Oxford in the 1950s. With the Ambassador now more than 20 years old, Hindustan was looking for an updated model to sell to car-starved Indians in a heavily regulated market where there were very few choices. Although Victor VX production ended in 1978, it took until 1984 before the car was ready to be built in India as the Hindustan Contessa. With its relative luxury, it was nicknamed the Indian Benz and was ordered by high-ranking government officials. Hindustan Motors didn't acquire the rights to the Vauxhall overhead cam engine though, so it would be fitted with the ancient BMC B-Series 1950s engine and 4-speed manual from the Ambassador. With just 50 horsepower, with a car that, remember, was overweight, that produced a very sluggish drive. So although reviewers liked the level of comfort, they didn't give it good reviews. That would change in the late 80s when Hindustan Motors managed to acquire the production rights to Isuzu's 1.8 litre engine. The top speed bumped up from 78 miles an hour to around 100. This helped, but the 80s and 90s brought more automotive competition to India, and soon the out-of-date Contessa was going up against much more modern and capable cars. Despite luxury upgrades and a more fuel-efficient diesel engine, the writing was on the wall and production ended in 2002. That meant that the Victor had, in one form or another, been mostly in production for over 40 years. The Victor had a lot going against it. A Vauxhall design and engineering team that didn't always produce the best car, and a buying public that were beginning to prefer smaller cars. But 5 generations of any car is pretty good going, and the Victor is a fascinating insight into GM's British operation in the 50s, 60s and 70s. If you want to know what happened after the Victor or see what sports cars Vauxhall was designing in the 60s, there's links to a couple of videos on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.